Okay, our first speaker is Leonora Camner. She is the managing director of Abundant Housing Los Angeles. And I came upon Leonora because she wrote an op-ed last October. Anyway, Abundant Housing LA was founded by a group of volunteers standing up for more housing and better neighborhoods, often known as not NIMBY, but YIMBY. Yes, in my backyard. Last October, Leonora wrote an LA Times op-ed encouraging the Los Angeles City Council to reject the Southern California's Association of Government Plan and Demand expensive cities with jobs accept more housing for low-income workers. We are fortunate to have Leonora talk about Abundant Housing LA's vision to solve the housing problem for the homeless and low-income workers. So let's have Leonora, and she will be sharing her screen, and we will be doing a short Q&A after her talk. Welcome, Leonora.
Thank you so much. Let me just get my screen situated here. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here and talk about Abundant Housing LA and the organization. So people who live in LA are facing a terrible housing crisis. Rents are too high and people are being displaced. If we continue down this road, we'll be a city that's lost its communities and has failed on its climate goals. My name is Leonora Camner, and I'm Executive Director of Abundant Housing LA. We are a growing movement of people demanding more homes to address rents, traffic, and climate change. We invite those of you who want a better housing future for LA to join us in changing the housing conversation through advocacy opportunities just like this one. Together, we'll build a city that reflects our values and respects human life and the environment. So I actually got started with Abundant Housing LA originally around 2016 as a volunteer. I want to do this presentation for you all about the root causes of the housing crisis, homelessness, and the solutions that we need. Historic and continuing racism is at the heart of our housing crisis. And before I get into that a little bit, I just want to preface this by saying I'm going to be talking about the racist history and the ongoing racism that intersects with our housing crisis, but this is in no way saying that, individual homeowners or anything are themselves racist, but I think it's important that we be honest about the racism in the systems that we all are a part of and participate in. And I think it's only through that honesty that we're going to improve as a society.
I'm sorry, Leonora, could you move your microphone just a tiny bit away from your mouth?
Yes.
Great.
Is that better?
That's better, yes, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So LA's housing history involves a history of explicit race restrictions. So these are some early examples of advertisements for neighborhoods with explicit race restrictions. So you can see in this that the racist exclusionary tools that were used on housing were actually an advertising point. They were a marketing strategy to sell homes. You can see, for example, here in this Eagle Rock advertisement, it says the residents of Eagle Rock are all of the white or Caucasian race. This was a selling point. LA's housing history also involves a history of redlining. So redlining was the practice of denying home loans to communities of color. On this map, you can see the red areas where communities were, or the red communities were effectively banned from this kind of financial assistance because they were communities of color. And this map is from 1939. So just to compare two of these areas, a green lined area and a red lined area. The green one, this is what was written in the description about this area that was approved for home loans. There was no shifting or infiltration. So what does that mean? So here's an example from a redlined area of the type of language they're using here to talk about shifting and infiltration. And I'm not going to repeat these words, but you can see this is direct and explicit racism that went into these housing policies. So exclusionary zoning, that's sort of the next stage of racist and exclusionary housing practices. So in the 1920s, explicitly racist zoning was banned by the Supreme Court. So single family only zoning originated partly as a way around the court's ruling. This was a means to segregate neighborhoods without explicitly banning any racial or religious group. The way that this worked was that minorities were less likely to be able to own a single family home as opposed to an apartment in a multifamily apartment building. Los Angeles added single family only zones to its code in 1921. It was one of the first cities in the nation to divide houses from apartments. Racially coded language was used to advertise the desirability of these primarily white neighborhoods. And in fact, this trend of growth of single family neighborhoods, we now term white flight. And the history of exclusion is why single family zoning is now called exclusionary zoning. And so in this map, which is actually from the New York Times, you can see nearly 75% of Los Angeles is the residential area zoned single family, even around rail transit lines. So even though we make these enormous public investments in things like transit, only because of single family zoning, only a few people who are wealthy enough to own a single family home can access those public benefits. So this is an example of the effects of single family zoning in my own neighborhood. So these are two different buildings, just actually a few blocks away from each other. The one on the left is in an area with a zip code where there's multifamily zoning. So that building on the left is actually a 6-unit building. 6 families can live comfortably there. And then on the right is a building in the zip code with single family zoning, and only 1 family is allowed to live there. So obviously the one on the right is much more expensive. And even though these buildings they look pretty similar, they have similar character. The one on the left houses many more families and is cheaper per unit. And you can see the effects on this in that the zip code on the left has an 8.8% population of Black people in that neighborhood. And then the one on the right, just going a few blocks away because of the single family zoning, that drops down to 0.8%. So that's the dramatic difference in the effects of single family zoning and those effects of exclusion. Housing scarcity is driving our housing affordability crisis. And a good illustration of that is this giant parking lot here where a lot of homes could be instead of a parking lot. So this chart shows how much scarcity contributes to high housing costs. So you can see on the x-axis here, as you go right across the graph, housing is getting more scarce in these metropolitan areas. So LA is an outlier here. It has the most scarce housing. That means we have the fewest number of homes per person. And then you can see on the y-axis, that is associated with high housing costs. So LA is a huge outlier here. We have the most housing scarcity and the highest housing costs. Those issues are related to each other. Housing production has been down for decades. We haven't been keeping up with growing demand and the population. A housing deficit was created over time, leading to our current crisis. You can see that here, how much housing has gone down over the decades. In this slide here, this is actually from the Everyone In campaign. But you can see sort of these two different forces acting on Angelenos, squeezing them. On the left side, you have stagnating incomes, incomes that are actually kind of going down a little bit there. And on the right, you have these skyrocketing housing costs. So these two factors together squeeze Angelenos and drive people into homelessness. And it also causes massive displacement. And I think it's also important to mention this, even people who are housed are squeezed by these two forces. So people who are able to be housed, they're paying high amounts of rent, they're rent burdened, their incomes are not going up. So this is the trajectory of homelessness. What this chart is actually a little outdated now. This is a year old. It doesn't incorporate the 2020 homelessness count. And so the 2020 homelessness count showed homelessness going up another 12%. So, and that's pre-pandemic. That count was done before the pandemic really got going, before the lockdowns. And, in this recession that we're in now, homelessness is absolutely going to go up. So this rate of increase is only going to get worse. And we're really on a trajectory for the acceleration of homelessness after this crisis. How much money would it cost to address our need for affordable housing in LA County? Let's do the math. So the calculation is that we need about 516,000 units of housing just to meet the needs of those who require subsidized affordable housing. So that 516,000 number is just for subsidized affordable units. And it costs at least $425,000 to build each one of those. So that number comes to nearly $220 billion. And if anything, this is a very conservative estimate. And that's just for the county. So that's how much money we would have to invest to fully meet our affordable housing needs. It's quite an enormous investment. And affordable housing so hard. Why is this so expensive? There are a couple different factors going on. One is Prop 13, and the other is structural issues that prevent housing from being built at all, making existing housing very expensive. So that makes land more and more valuable. Only a limited number of families can live on that land, and we can't really tax it. So there's an accumulation of wealth in that land. One example of that, in effect, is that from 2017 to 2018, the total assessed property value in LA County increased by 100 billion. So there is a lot of money there. Why is there never enough money for affordable housing? Well, a lot of that money is just accumulating in land values because of housing scarcity and because of Prop 13. Without larger zoning and housing reform, any funding for supportive housing will ultimately fail. So let's say we somehow raise $100 billion to start addressing our affordable housing needs. We're just going to be dumping money into the problem if we don't also address this upstream issue of zoning and land use. So we need to also address that issue while making these public investments in housing. This is an example of that. This slide from LAHSA shows that even though we raised a historic amount of funding through HHH and H, more people kept falling into homelessness than we were able to house. So we need to address the housing crisis at its source, and that's what LAHSA concluded in this presentation, was that they, even with large amounts of funding, they're not able to house enough people if these upstream factors are causing more people to fall into homelessness than we can keep up with. So why do we have this upstream problem? Why don't we have more home construction? Local barriers to housing development have intensified, particularly in the high-growth metropolitan areas, increasingly fueling the national economy. The accumulation of such barriers, including zoning, other land use regulations, and lengthy development approval processes, has reduced the ability of many housing markets to respond to growing demand. And this is from Barack Obama's Housing Development Toolkit in 2016. So already in 2016, the Obama administration was starting to bring attention to this issue going on in Los Angeles. And in their report, they even had a specific section on Los Angeles and the downzoning that's occurred here. So you can see, even though originally Los Angeles could fit 10 million people in our zoning, that was lowered and lowered while our population was going up. We made less and less room for people. And so our zone capacity is very limited. What if we change our zoning and land use policies to allow more housing? We could go from this to something like this: more walkable, inclusive, human-centered neighborhoods. And another benefit to consider is mixed income housing. So this is a project, this is an example of a mixed income project, which would have created 700 homes, and it would have included over 60 subsidized affordable homes for people of lower incomes. So they were using the profits made off of this 700 home project to subsidize the rents for more than 60 families, basically. That's what this project was going to be. And this project was actually killed over a year ago. So think about what a difference 700 homes would have made. And this was in the Mar Vista area with a lot of jobs. It has a jobs housing imbalance. So think about what a difference now 700 homes would have made, with over 60 of those affordable to lower incomes. So it's projects like these getting killed all over the county that would start to chip away at our housing crisis, but many of them are getting killed. Building more densely is pro-environment and preserves natural habitats. So I have this cute little illustration showing that the environment is saved when we build more densely. You can see the top one is, there's a larger footprint for the city when we have low density suburban sprawl. And the lower one contrasts that with some dense buildings, some dense multifamily apartment buildings, where more environmental space is preserved. Climate change, I think it's really important to connect housing with climate change as well. Cars and trucks are nearly 1/5 of all US emissions. And so we have to address car dependence. We have to dramatically reduce the usage of cars because they're such a large source of greenhouse gas emissions. Reducing car dependence also helps reduce traffic. Getting more people out of cars and into buses and bicycles and walking. That addresses our traffic problems. Traffic is a huge issue in Los Angeles. And the only way to do that is through having dense homes near jobs, near transit, near commercial areas so that people can walk. They're not locked into these mega commutes just to go to their job or to go to the commercial areas where they want to go. Dense living uses resources more efficiently and costs less per person. So you can see in this chart, they're comparing the costs of a suburban single-family home to a household in a dense multifamily area. And you can see, because it takes up less space, it doesn't need as much infrastructure, that cost per person is lower. So this is more sustainable, it's more efficient. you know, and this is also really important now as cities are facing really enormous budget cuts. And more housing means more livability. It means more enjoyable places that you can walk around in, healthier businesses with more foot traffic and employees living close to jobs, less car dependence, less traffic, more diversity. So what can the average person do to support more housing? You know, we can go to our local government. A lot of these zoning and land use decisions are made on the local government level. And actually in the local government level, you have a much more powerful voice. So for example, you know, in my home city, Santa Monica, we have about 92,000 people, and say only 5 people show up to a local city council meeting. Well, that means each one of those people showing up represents nearly 18,000 people. So, you know, obviously that statistic would vary depending on how many people show up to the meeting or where you live. But the idea is that because so few people pay attention to the things going on at their own neighborhood or city council level, you know, you have the potential impact of thousands of people. But the problem is that so many of these local conversations are dominated by opposition. So, you know, there is just a fact of human psychology. People are more motivated by what they're opposed to instead of what they support. So, you know, what we see is on this local level, there's just so much opposition. These are examples of local opposition in these project hearings. You know, the top left one is from Paseo Marina, the project that I had in here earlier. And then here's a couple of examples of people opposing supportive housing, so housing for homeless people. And that happens constantly with every project all over the county. And, you know, that's why it's so hard to get all this built. You know, recently Abundant Housing was supporting a supportive housing project for homeless people in Venice. And that project received over 700 letters in opposition. And that was just for 50 units. So, you know, we have hundreds of thousands of units that we need in terms of affordable and supportive housing. And we can't, you know, just imagine, you know, having this big of a fight over every 50 units. You know, we're not going to get there unless there's major change. Like, we can't have fights on this scale for every 50 units if we're going to get there. So that's why it's so important, you know, everyone showing up on their own local government to support housing. You know, this is an example of some of our volunteers going to a hearing to support housing. So I just want to finish off encouraging everybody to get involved. You can check out our organization at abundanthousingle.org. It's easy to sign up. We send out a weekly action item. So every week it's super easy to support housing. It just takes one click. You know, Anne was referring to a recent action item we had on Article 34 repeal. Article 34 is just an explicitly racist piece of the California Constitution that requires 2/3 vote for any time public housing is going to be built in a community. So that's another huge barrier to getting public investment in housing. It's just literally, it's really hard in our Constitution, and it's accepted now that was a racially motivated piece of our Constitution. I think it's completely unacceptable that in 2020 we're still allowing that to be a part of our Constitution, you know. So that's why Senators Ben Allen and Scott Wiener are trying to get Article 34 repeal on the ballot so that voters can take that out of the Constitution. And I really think that you know, the voters are very interested in repealing something like that. I do think it is a huge embarrassment for us to have it in California, and it is standing in the way of us getting more public investment in housing. So definitely encourage you to get involved if you want to learn more about Article 34 repeal, or how to support projects in your own neighborhood, or other advocacy projects that we're getting involved with. You can check that out and sign up for our newsletter. So that's the end of my presentation. Are we doing questions now?
Yes. Let's, why don't you stop sharing, and we'll have, I saw one during your presentation, but I think you answered it. It had to do with why was the one in, I think, Mar Vista, why was that killed? And I think you answered it in terms of the public outrage over it. Nancy Silver has a question. Do you want to ask it, Nancy? You want to unmute since you're Nancy?
Okay, I've unmuted.
Great.
So I guess what I think there's a lot of hypocrisy around the issue. So all of us live in this nice neighborhood of Palos Verdes. Most of us live in single family homes. I live in a homeowners association complex. But I just think we all have to ask ourselves, are we willing to give up our single family homes, live in a high density neighborhood? And I mean, I can say, yeah, I'd like to support housing for people. I don't want to have people homeless, but we don't usually want that in our neighborhood. I mean, go build some high density housing, but usually not in our own neighborhood. So I think there's a lot of hypocrisy around that issue. And, even 50, what was the bill? I don't know if it was a assembly bill or state bill.
SB 50.
Yeah. In the peninsula, they all said, I think most of the cities said, no, we don't want that. We don't want any high density around transit lines, along Hawthorne, not in our neighborhood. Like, okay, you could build it, but somewhere. So I don't see how we're going to address the issue, because, okay, we're all out there saying, yes, we're concerned, we're interested, we're all these white people, right? We're want to do it. But then if push comes to shove, we don't want to lose what we have, right? We think we've earned it, and we don't want to have that kind of lifestyle. So we'll go put them in downtown LA, or we'll put them in Carson, or put them, so I don't know, how do you address that issue? I mean, that's, now it's all set in place. We've got these lifestyles, we've got these homes. How would you address that issue?
Nancy, I thank you so much. I agree with you so much about this point and the issue of hypocrisy. I think that is definitely something that happens. I think I'm a little bit more hopeful about it, because I mean, we're not talking about individuals having to give up their own homes for density.
Right.
As long as we're not talking about the redevelopment of existing renters, that's a whole other issue. But when we're talking about upzoning single family areas that are mostly owner occupied, no one's being forced out of their homes in that kind of situation.
Right.
The project I talked about earlier, Paso Marina, that's replacing a commercial area. So there's I think it's very important to protect renters from displacement as we do this, but putting that aside, I think supporting housing, it doesn't mean giving up your own home, or like,
yeah, no, and I know it doesn't,
yeah.
But I'm just saying, I'm sort of playing devil's advocate, because as Joan Davidson's saying, of course, cities have the right to create their own general plan and zoning. And so I think that's the issue that's facing the state, is, the state with AB 50 was trying to say, okay, we're going to put this into place, and cities are saying, no, you can't just do that, right? We have these rights. So I just think it's so complicated. I don't see how we're going to address it.
Okay, Nancy, I want to give other people an opportunity.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
All right.
If I could just say one more thing in response to that, I think there are a lot of really tangible, immediate benefits to neighborhoods if we support more housing. That was sort of like the latter part of my presentation about how we get more vibrant commercial areas, we get less traffic. So there are, there's a reason that we all enjoy being tourists in cities that have multifamily housing and have mixed commercial and residential areas, because there is a lot of livability there. And so I think we could get a lot of those benefits in our own neighborhoods. And so I think it can be this win-win thing. So that's why I'm hopeful that neighborhoods will really take it on themselves to embrace these changes at some point.
Okay, I'm going to allow one more question, and then we'll have other questions after all three speakers, but let's have one more question. It looks like, Joan, you've had several. Let's at least do why don't you at least unmute and ask one of your questions, and then we'll do the others later.
I would like to add something to the homeless.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make everyone aware of the federal government's investigating. I'm sure you've seen it in the LA Times, and if not, you should be looking it up. A lot of the LA councilmen have been wielding their power and wasting affordable housing funds because they're giving it to their favorite developers, so to speak. I'm going to be nice about this. You can read the story in the newspaper. But the bottom line is the government has given out money. LA City has what it's called Proposition HHH, over $1 billion of funding for supportive and needy and homeless housing. And now they've had almost 4 years to put this into reality, and one little building of 60 units has been built. So I'm getting pretty, what would you call it, cynical about federal and tax money being given for the right thing to happen when it doesn't happen. For instance, LA City is giving a lot of funding, and so is HUD, to old hotels downtown to support affordable housing. And and then of course the basic, and then nothing seems to be going at a very fast pace.
But can you get to your question?
Yes, every city, I believe, has the right to create their own general plan and their own zoning. If you take that away, which I don't think technically they have the right to do, and I think Huntington Beach is already suing on this, I think there'll be a lot of other lawsuits coming down the pike, because every city wants the right to have local zoning, and the state is trying to take that away.
Okay, let's let her answer that, okay?
No, I'm just saying, so what can be done in that regard? I understand we need affordable housing, and the word affordable is going to mean something different to every community. In our community, it's $3,500 a month. Downtown, it's going to be $500 a month. So I don't know how we resolve it. I'm just throwing these things out to you because it's really something important you should think about. Do you want to change your local neighborhood? I don't think we do. We worked very hard. We came a long way to do that. I don't want 6 units next to my house.
Okay, let's let that one go and let Leonora answer, and then we're going to go on to our next speaker.
Okay.
So there were a lot of questions there. I mean, I guess I'm just going to start with the last thing about, do we want our neighborhoods to change? I mean, our neighborhoods have to change. That's the reality. And I know that that's unfortunate, but I think we all have to be honest about it. We're facing crises on enormous scales, not just the homelessness crisis, but the climate crisis. And it's because of the status quo that we have those crises. It's because of the way the world exists now that the future is looking so dark. And I have kids. I want to make sure we have a future for them, and that means changing our neighborhoods. I think that change is hard. It can be undesirable, but ultimately, I think we can build a better future where our kids can be optimistic and can feel about the world, good about the world they're going to live in, where we don't have to explain why we're letting our neighbors live on the streets. So that's only going to come from changing our neighborhoods. In terms of like the corruption at the city council level, I mean, there's corruption. That's something we all have to recognize and accept. I think a huge issue in that corruption is the fact that the way LA zoning code works, because we have so little zoning, like we basically don't zone for more multifamily housing. So each project has to get its own individual approval. It has to get its own zone change because like this larger plan doesn't allow for more housing. So that creates the conditions for a lot of corruption. But if we had a lot more holistic planning, if we had holistic zoning where we were planning for our housing needs, then council members wouldn't be put in this situation where they're going to benefit from bribery and they're going to benefit from corruption, because there would be like a transparent, holistic process for getting housing built, and that's not what we have right now. And so we need to upzone, we need to allow for more housing, and that's going to really address the corruption too.
Okay, so again, we'll get back to some of this. I want to get on to our next speaker, but I do want to just say one thing. I think what Leonora is talking about is not like what you were saying, Joan, about having a multifamily housing project right next to your house. There's a lot of open space here, and she's saying to let's speak creatively in terms of using that open space in terms of allowing more housing. So it's not like, a big apartment going up next to your house. That's not what she was saying. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Well, I mean, let me clarify. I mean, I do think, this is about like, yes, in my backyard, right? So it's like if a 6-unit project next to you, that's really like, I could go back to my slide where I'm comparing a 6-unit building to a single family home. They look honestly identical. I live in a 6-unit building myself, and a lot of people think it's a single family home because it really it looks completely in scale with the neighborhood. And I don't know, I actually find it to be extremely beneficial to the neighborhood that we have buildings of that size. And I'm grateful every day that my neighborhood allowed 6-unit buildings, because that's the only reason that I can live here. And so, and like, I feel fortunate to be in that position. So I think like if we realize the benefits and the value of a 6-unit building, then the idea of one going up next to us, that's actually a positive thing. That's something, that we could embrace because it's good for people, it's good for our neighbors, it's good for our community.